One of the main draws of the Seiko 5 line of watches is their affordable price tag. They are pretty much the cheapest entry into a mechanical watch available from a big brand. Not only that though, they're reliable, robust, and with so many styles, there's one to suit everyone's taste. Well, in this case, two. Welcome to Addicted to Watches. Today, we'll be doing a 2-for-1 with some Seiko 5s. They both share quite a similar case design, but separate themselves through their dial, colour and style. They are both now discontinued, and less common than some other Seiko 5s from their time. These are the Seiko 5 SNXA13 and SNX123. So, on the left side we have the brown dialed SNXA13, and on the right, the black dialed SNX123. Some people can do two things at once, but I can't, so let's take a look at them one at a time. Just before we do that though, a quick look around the case shows us just how similar their case designs are. I guess when you have the sheer number of models that Seiko have in their 5 range, you start reusing things a bit. I don't mind that at all though. More combinations means you can zero in on a style you like. I personally prefer the brown dial between the two, so I'll save that till last. That means we're looking at the SNX123 first. Just looking at the watch, there is an obvious comparison to make to the Rolex Explorer with that dial layout, black dial and straightforward case. In a lot of ways, it does embody the ideas behind the Explorer 2, while offering it in a much more attainable package. What better place to start than the dial? It's black, but it's not just black. It has a subtle sunburst finishing that catches the light occasionally, but most of the time just looks black. It creates a really nice effect in settings with stronger lighting. Around that dial, we have a mixture of applied indices. Most are triangular indices pointing in towards the center of the dial, but at 12, 6 and 9, we have applied Arabic numerals. Usually, I don't like triangular indices pointing inwards like that. It looks a bit too harsh. But these ones are small enough, narrow enough, and rounded just enough to not worry me. Instead of the marker at 3, like pretty much every other Seiko 5, we have a day and date complication. Since the hour markers are polished, I think this is one situation where I'd prefer a black day and date wheel. There are many other Seiko 5s that do this, so I'm not quite sure why they didn't go with that option here. That day and date is surrounded by an applied frame to match the other indices. Around those is a printed minute track with half seconds also marked by a slightly shorter line. I kinda like this as those longer minutes mimic the hour hands a bit. At each hour, there is also a small circular dot of lume to give the watch a bit of after dark legibility. Sadly, the lume on this watch overall is nothing special and a bit disappointing. The last thing to mention about the dial is the applied Seiko logo and shield above the pinion, and the word automatic printed in white below. I have to say, I prefer this older version of the Seiko 5 shield to the newer Superman one, but I can understand they're wanting to update it to a more modern design. The hands are quite simple Dauphine hands, which have a loomed section and slight bevel running down the center. Like the hours, the lume here is average at best. Their size in proportion to the rest of the dial is good and makes it easy to read the time at a glance. As you'd expect from a budget watch, no sapphire crystal here, just a flat hardlex crystal that sits flush with the case. There is no AR coating either, but that's perfectly acceptable at the budget price point. If we move out a little to look at the case, we're presented with a 37mm case diameter, which sounds small, but the watch has quite a solid presence on wrist. Part of that is thanks to the 12mm case height and 43mm lug to lug, but it's also thanks to the curve of the case into the lugs, which makes them wider than they otherwise might be. In proportion to the rest of the case, the lug width is 19mm, which is a little annoying, as alternate straps will be a little bit trickier to find. Up front, we have an angled polished bezel that catches the light nicely in combination with the sunburst effect on the dial. The top surfaces of the lugs are brushed to provide a bit of contrast, and these transition into polished sides. Looking from the side, the case doesn't curve very much, but the caseback makes it look extra thick and top heavy. I think that is due to the fact that it's a display caseback, revealing the 7s26 movement beating away inside. I can say this somewhat confidently because my other Seiko 5, the SNXA13 is an older version with a solid caseback, and is significantly thinner. As a result, when on wrist, the watch sits quite high, but it's not too drastic. One thing that Seiko 5s are notorious for are subpar bracelets. I must be in the minority of people who think that they don't deserve the hate that they get. Don't get me wrong, the bracelets are cheap and light, but I've never lost any hairs to them, and I have more than enough on my arm that I should. Also, there is a difference between the feeling in hand and on wrist. In hand, the bracelet does feel very hollow, but on wrist you don't really notice the difference much, and I kind of just forget about it. It's a folded 3-piece link with hollow end links. The surface is brushed to match the finishing on the top of the case, and where many other bracelets have a wider center link and narrower outer links, this one has all 3 links almost equal in terms of width. The clasp is a simple pressed clasp. It does have a lot of micro adjustment positions though for a good fit, as well as the Seiko logo engraved on the outer shell. It's pretty standard as far as Seiko 5 bracelets and clasps go. One aspect where this watch differs a bit from a lot of other Seiko 5 watches is that the crown is at the 3 o'clock rather than 4. It is quite small and slightly recessed into the case, like many others, but the position, albeit a more traditional one for most watches, is a bit out of the ordinary here. The crown is unsigned as you'd expect, but looking from the side here, it's almost comical how small it is compared to the rest of the case. As a result, in operation it can be a bit tricky setting the time and changing the day and date. Now, I've said it has a bit more wrist presence than 37mm might suggest, so let's get it on wrist and see how it looks. On wrist, I think you can see that it doesn't look small at all, even though the case doesn't curve much. The top surface of the lugs appear to curve more, helping it to look like it hugs the wrist. As I turn my wrist, you can see that sunburst dial in action, as well as the polished bezel catching the light. What you can also see is the way that the thick caseback makes the head of the watch sit quite high and off the wrist. Overall, I'd say it's a good size to achieve what I think it wants to achieve. An understated functional watch that flies under the radar and doesn't draw attention to itself. But the fun is not over. In fact, we're only halfway through. We've got another watch to look at. Admittedly, we won't spend as much time on this one, as the case is very similar. But let's start with the most striking feature of this SNXA13, which is of course that lovely brown dial. Brown is a colour that you don't see all that often, but is slowly becoming more common on watches. I am a fan of a chocolate dial, like the one on my SBGR311. Like the first watch we looked at, this too has a sunburst dial, but one with a much stronger, more dynamic effect. The dial layout is also different, with loomed rectangles marking most hours. At 3, we have a day and date complication, and at 12 double rectangles to help you orient the watch. Overall, the dial is a little more simple with just the minutes marked, but that just brings the focus back to the rich brown colour of the dial. The hands are also slightly different, being loomed fence post hands. Looking at the dial and hands overall, the loom should be much better than the SNX123 we looked at earlier. And it is better, but only a bit. It could be to do with the age of these watches, as they are not particularly recent, but I was a little bit underwhelmed by the loom. The case overall is very similar with some slight differences too. Instead of a flat angled bezel, this one is curved, and the lugs are a bit slimmer, making the case look more refined and streamlined. It does have that same thick caseback, making the watch feel very top heavy. And if the SNX123 had a difficult crown to use, this one is worse. It's even more recessed, so when changing the time it's quite easy to accidentally push the crown back in. The size of the case is also very similar. Diameter and lug to lug are virtually the same, with the only real difference being a ½ millimeter in height. This one being the thinner one at 11.5 millimeters. The bracelet is also different, a 5-piece link as opposed to 3, but other than that pretty much the same. Folded links, hollow end links, and generally light. The clasp is exactly the same on both watches. Unfortunately, this watch has a bit more wear and tear, especially those scratches on the Hardlex crystal. Thankfully though, you can still see the brilliant brown dial underneath. And let's take a proper look, getting it on wrist. Immediately you can see that where the SNX123 had more broad shoulders at the lugs, this case is a bit more narrow and a bit more sleek. As I turn my wrist, that dial comes to life, and even though the watch appears smaller, it doesn't look undersized. The overall style of this is much dressier, and the slimmer profile really suits that. So, that's two watches that, while sharing a very similar case, shape and profile, are quite different in their intent and execution. They both represent great value when available, and offered a lot in terms of their design. Though they have been replaced by different designs and models in Seiko's new 5 Sports collection, there are plenty of other Seiko 5s available new from this older range. The prices may have increased a bit since they were discontinued, but they still offer some great designs and great value. What do you think about this watch? Have you got a Seiko 5 in your collection? Had you come across either of these before? Do you prefer the newer Seiko 5 line? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.